Welcome to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, here to share some amazing conversations. We're talking business, health, making and saving money, or starting something epic. Think of this as your go-to spot for stories that do a lot more than just kill time. They spark ideas, give you a boost, and perhaps even change the way you look at the world. I'm pulling in the experts, the thinkers, the doers, and the dreamers. We're about to dive into stories that open doors and ideas that light up your brain. Here we go. Welcome, everyone, to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, and with me today is my guest, Walli Miller. Welcome to the show, Walli. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much, Desiree, for having me. I know I love talking about money, and I know this conversation is going to be very exciting for me.
Absolutely. And so just to tell the listeners about you, you are the owner, founder of Financially Thriving Money Coaching. You are a financial coach, and there's some really exciting stuff that we're going to talk about. But a couple of things I want to share right this minute is you retired at the age of 39 years old, which is tremendous. Congratulations for that. But really your goal and I think mission, it sounds like, has always been to empower professional women, to help them build wealth, relieve that kind of financial stress, really create a work optional life, and also to teach and empower clients to break generational barriers. And so we're going to touch on some of this today, but Walli, why don't you share with us how this journey happened for you and what led you down this path to where you are today?
Yeah, again, thank you so much for having me. I wish I could say that I was always good with money, but I wasn't. I actually did not. I thought I was good in that there were some things that I picked up on, which was you want to stay out of debt if possible, stay away from credit card debt. And so in my mind, I thought I was good with money because I stayed out of credit card debt. Now, I did have student loans, I had a car note, but in my mind, I was doing okay. I knew that if I could, when I started into the workforce, I was like, if I could pay my bills and stay out of credit card debt, I'm going to be okay. And a lot of the financial advice speak to this, right? Now, it wasn't until years later that I realized, wait a minute, there's like this whole other component to being good with finances that I was sort of missing. And I didn't know anyone in my family, anybody in my circle who really understood or who were building wealth. And even that word, building wealth, that word wealth, I didn't really relate to it. So it wasn't until I sort of realized a few years into my career that all I had for the money that I was making was the clothes in my closet and the shoes on my floor, and realized, okay, I think I might be missing something here.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And I think that you mentioned something really important there. It's one thing to be able to pay your basic living expenses, and it's another thing to save and build for your future and that quote unquote wealth. And that means, different things to different people. But coming out of college and just starting your life, we think that it's just about having a job and paying our bills. But there's so much more to that. And I think you're right on with what you just shared. What do you think? Because I think many people are in this boat where it's just paying the necessities or paying off debt and not really putting aside any money for their future. So what do you think is going on there? And what do you want to share with the listeners that can help maybe change the way they're thinking about that?
Yeah. For every person, the goals are going to be really different. And the way that I like to even think about financial goals is, sure, you might have a long-term goal of retiring at the age of 65, or you may have a goal of saving for a down payment. But I like to think about saving money in sort of two categories. Generally, people understand that if there is, for every dollar that you earn, you want to see if you can try to set some money aside, right? And that could say, maybe that's $25 per paycheck. Maybe that's $400 a month. Just put it into a savings account. And some of us do that. Some of us set money aside from the income that we earn. And then for other people, what will happen is that it becomes difficult because there's not a strong why and a strong goal attached to it. So then it becomes, well, what am I saving this money? Why am I setting this money aside for anyways? So I think it's really important to sort of understand, what are we saving for? Now, I mentioned that there's sort of two buckets, two ways that I like to think about money. And one is is the saving for an emergency, right? And you get to define when you can touch that emergency fund, right? One of my clients used this phrase and I loved it. And she was like, it's my do not touch unless you're dying fund, right? If there's a loss of income, if there is a really unexpected, unplanned expense, you have this money to cover those emergencies. Most of us, what we do is that we lump all the savings together. And if we want to make a purchase, pay for a vacation, we dig into the savings, right? And this could work for some people, but for most of us, it doesn't work. And so the way I like to sort of separate it is we have the emergency fund set aside for emergencies. And then we have the savings fund, or maybe like a slush fund that is meant to be used and meant to be spent. And if we can begin thinking about savings in that way, we then can attach the goals with it, right? There will be sometimes people who will save money for something and then have a lot of resistance to spending the money, or they save money because everything is all mixed in. And so I really encourage my clients, let's think about it in two different buckets. There's the emergency fund, and then we're saving it to spend it, and that is not a problem. So I really like to help people sort of understand that and see that.
Yeah, that's a great point. This idea of kind of different accounts that you're putting money, and everybody's going to have to choose that differently, right? Depending on their income level and their particular needs, but keeping them separate with kind of a separate title for what that's to be used for can give us a really good visual and an idea of why we're even bothering to put money in there. I love the title. It's like, you can't use this money unless it's absolutely an emergency. That's a great way to think about it. Or unexpected things like cars break down, tires have to be replaced, whatever the case is. But if you can just kind of put away a little bit into each of those accounts, if you will, you can really make a dent in whatever you're saving for a vacation or whatever the case may be. So I love that idea. But so what about people who have debt? And so they have to pay that, but they also want to be saving. What are some thoughts on how to manage that?
I think that there's definitely a way to do both. And in most cases, it's really highly recommended that you do both. Here's why. If we focus on using every extra dollars that we have to pay off debt when the emergency happens, because it's not if, it's when the emergency happens, how will we afford that? How will we pay for that? And generally, we'll need to borrow it. We will need to borrow it from a friend, a family member, or put it on a credit card. And then we're just in the same cycle. When we're thinking about finances and sort of learning how to gain control of it, I like for people to really understand you have to get real intimate with what your numbers are. And what does that mean? What is your numbers? Well, first, let's really understand what your income is, right? And this is really important for those people who might have businesses where the income is a bit inconsistent, or perhaps you work off a commission or sales, or you have sort of variable income. We really want to have a good understanding over the last 3, 4, 5 months. What on average am I bringing in every month? Okay. So really understand what your income is. The next category is understanding your expenses. Now, some of those expenses are going to be really easy to figure out: your rent, your mortgage, car insurance, internet, things like that, car payment. We really want to understand what those fixed expenses are and those most essential expenses, right? Really understand that if you were to lose your income, how would you be able to keep food on the table? Or what expenses need to get paid in order to keep food on the table, a roof over your head, gas in the car, keep the lights on, right? So really understand what your most essential expenses are, and then think about those things that add to your quality of life. Those things that bring you joy, those things that you look forward to, because it's not about eliminating that. It's about really making sure that every transaction, every time you tap your phone or swipe your card or pull cash out, that you know that every single dollar is going exactly where you want to go. And I recommend for people to do sort of an expense audit to really make sure that, especially in a household, that not every single family member has a Netflix account. Like if we're living under one roof, let's make sure we have one subscription service. We want to make sure that every single expense has a purpose, right? If we don't do that, if we don't really get familiar with how we're spending money, what might happen is you might have what I like to call wallet leaks. And it's that money where you're like, okay, I bring in this amount of money. This is what my bills are. I'm supposed to have money left over, but I never have money left over every month, right? So we really want to understand that. You asked the question also about how do you balance saving and paying off debt, right? When we're thinking about getting healthy and really creating financial wellness and then building wealth, the way you do it is using one of two levers. We're either really focusing on how do we increase the income or how do we decrease the expenses. And the reason for that is that your income minus your expenses is what's going to be left over to help you build wealth, to help you build safety, to help you build security, and to help you pay off debt. And if that number is too low, then we need to understand how do we reduce expenses and how do we increase income. Now, I mentioned those are two levers, but guess what? We can pull both of them at the same time to really sort of accelerate the goals that we want to reach financially. And so, sure, if you have debt, we want to understand what type of debt it is because not all debt is created equally. There's some debt that costs us a lot of money to hold on to that debt. And this is considered high interest debt, things like a credit card, right? Where the credit card interest could be 18, 20, even 30% interest, right? And then there's some debt that has lower interest rates, something like a mortgage perhaps, right? And something that it's okay if we hold on to that debt because there are ways to sort of gain money back. And we can talk about that in a bit, that we can gain money back, that it makes sense to not sort of throw in every extra dollar to that low interest debt. So I think really getting familiar to what type of debt do you have, and then focusing on the high interest debt, and then focusing on those debts that have the highest emotional baggage, right? So there might be some debt, even if it's low interest, but maybe you owe a parent some money or you owe a friend or a family member some money. And it just really weighs on you that you haven't paid them back yet. That could be a priority for you. And that is a way for you to sort of prioritize how do we sort of think about debt payments.
Great points, Wally. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I love the idea of we can move the levers at the same time and really make a difference. Yes, it's one thing to be able to reduce your expenses, and maybe you're in a position that you can't necessarily increase your income immediately. So that might be something that you can adjust. But if you're in a job that is commission based or something where you have an opportunity to also increase your income level, what a difference that can make. And the point that you just touched on about perhaps you've had to borrow money from family members or friends or whatever, and that absolutely might be the priority for you just for your own peace of mind and that relationship that you're paying that first. Yeah, nobody wants a 25% interest on their credit card debt, but this other type of debt might be more important to pay off initially. And then once that's done, you can kind of refocus and then direct it toward that higher interest card. So great suggestion there. And so what do you think about if we've got these different credit card debts, let's just say, how are we divvying up the money if we want to be paying these off? Are we going to tackle the highest interest first, 100%, or are we going to kind of split it between the cards? What are your thoughts?
There are 1,000 ways to get into debt and to accumulate debt, but there are a few tried and true ways of being able to pay off that debt. And every person is going to be a little bit different. One of the things that I do with my clients in our sessions is that when we're talking about creating a debt payoff strategy, we take a look at all of the different avenues, the different methods that there are. So some of the most common ones are something called the snowball method. And the snowball method is where you focus on paying the debt with the lowest balance first. You say, okay, I only owe $300 on this credit card. I want to pay that one off first and then focus on the one next in line. So you sort of arrange your debt from the lowest balance to the highest balance. Another way of thinking about it, and I like to show my clients not only the time frame, but the cost of doing it in different situations or different scenarios, right? The different debt payoff strategies. Another way to think about it is to arrange all of your debt from the debt with the highest interest to the lowest interest and focusing on that. And sometimes those dates and the amount that you are paying in interest is very close together. It's not too much of a difference. Sometimes, though, using one method over another method might cost you more, might take longer, and might cost you more. And so one of the things that we really want to do is understand that. When we're thinking about money and managing our finances, we really want to understand the relationship with money that we have. And studies have shown that our relationship with money is shaped and formed between the ages of 7 and 10. So I just want you to sit for one moment and think about what that is really meaning. That means that what we were seeing, what we were learning, what we were observing and absorbing has shaped our relationship with money. So if you grew up in a household where money was abundant and there were healthy conversations around money, it's likely that you have an abundant and healthy relationship with money. But if you grew up in a household where money was scarce or there were different patterns that you saw, you may either mimic those same things or go to the complete opposite, right? So we really want to understand what our relationship with money is. One of the things that I always like to mention is that money isn't only about the math, right? So it's not only about which debt is going to cost me the most money, is also thinking about which one is going to help me sleep better at night if I let go of it. And so when we're thinking about managing our finances, we want to understand the math. That is important, but it's only one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is how we interact, how we relate to what that number is telling us. Right. And we want to make sure that we check in with our emotions, and we want to make sure, I know this might sound a little woo woo, but we want to understand, what is our money mindset, right? When we look at the number, what does that number represent to us, right? Someone who has $4,000 of credit card debt might feel incredibly anxious, is losing sleep at night over $4,000 of credit card debt, where then somebody who has $18,000 of credit card debt might feel good, right? Not that they're happy about the debt, but that they have a plan for it. And so we really want to understand, sure, let's take a look at the math, and it's simple. We're adding, we're subtracting, and let's look at what those numbers come out to, what the output of that calculation is. But then we want to understand, what is it about that number that is making me feel the way that I do, right? Do you like that feeling? You might be really happy with maybe the amount that you have in your savings account. You may be really happy with the amount that's in your 401k, for example. But we really want to get to know our numbers, and it's not just the amount in the checking account. This is why I said we really want to get financially intimate, or we want to get intimate with our financial numbers. We want to get financially naked and really understand not just the income, not just the expenses, but our overall financial picture.
So interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I had no idea that it was ages 7 to 10 when we're, as children growing up, observing this in that age range and then having it influence us later in life. No idea at all. So thank you for that point. Something really for us all to consider is like, what were we experiencing at that time? What were we seeing at that time? But also this idea around our mindset around the money and what debt means to us and what our financial picture looks like and how does that make us feel and the choices that we're making around that. So really super interesting. So can we talk a little bit more about how we can begin to maybe heal issues that we're having if we discover like, wow, I didn't realize how unhealthy a relationship I had with money. What can we begin to do about it?
Yeah. So I love this question. I think people really underestimate how powerful the emotions that we have behind the numbers can be. Some people will avoid opening credit card statements, opening their mailboxes. I mean, I think a lot of people now get electronic invoices and electronic statements, and we don't even open them, right? Because we don't want to see that number in full. We're like, tell me what the minimum due is. That's all I care about. And so we really want to understand, what is it about looking at those numbers and how it makes us feel, and be okay with how you're feeling at the moment. I had one client who was trying to save up their first $1,000. And I said, okay, the goal is in the next 60 days, we're going to save $1,000. And that really was stressful. And one of the first thoughts that they had was, that number is too big. I've never done it before. And while we were in our session, one of the things that came out was they never tried, right? They never tried. So it went from, that's impossible, I've never done it before, to they never tried. And so these are the things that we want to be able to explore. It's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to feel sad or frustrated or shame. Sometimes there's embarrassment because of the information that you didn't have at the time. When you put something on a credit card, you may not have known what that was going to look like later on, right? When we took out student loans, right? And sometimes we take out a little bit more, we may not really understand the repercussions of that. And so you did what was best, what was necessary for you at the time. And even if it was a splurge, maybe it was, oh my goodness, I can't believe I bought that handbag. I can't believe I put X amount of dollars for a trip I didn't even enjoy, or I spent X amount of dollars on a meal I don't even remember what I ordered, right? Even if today you have a regret about it, at the time that you did it, it was fulfilling a need, right? And this is one of the things that we want to understand is, what is our spending triggers? Some people will spend to feel better. Some people will spend to celebrate. Some people will spend if they're sad. Some people will be really impulsive. And actually, that was my story. I was quite an impulsive shopper. And in my mind, I paid my bills. So I was like, check. I set a little bit of money aside into a savings account. So I said, check. And then I was like, what do I do with the rest of it? And so I would just spend. I would be on my way in a car to go put gas in the car. And I would like take a detour to Nordstrom or the mall or Ross or Marshall's or Burlington Coat Factory, right? And in my mind, I wasn't spending on very expensive things. Oh no. I was buying things on a discount, right? But I was a very impulsive shopper. I would go pick up medication at a pharmacy, and then I would like leave with stationery and magazines and notebooks. And it's really sort of understanding, where is that coming from? And I was just, in a way, sort of filling in a need that I had as a child, right? I'm the daughter of an immigrant. We grew up in the Bronx. We were a low income family. And my parents never said things like money doesn't grow on trees, but they did say things like, we can't afford that, right? And they did say no. So I stopped asking, right? There came a point in my life where I just realized I'm never going to be able to get it. So I just stopped asking. And so what that in turn turned into was that then when I had some money and I had paid my bills and I had set some money aside, then I would just spend the rest. And I was filling a need that as a kid, I couldn't get some of the things that I wanted, that now I could. And so it turned into very impulsive, a lot of mindless spending and a lot of mindless shopping. And it was, again, from some of the things that I learned and some of the things that I absorbed. And now I was staying out of credit card debt. So remember, that was sort of my thing. I was like, okay, as long as I can pay it off and I can pay for it, I'm okay. But not realizing that I was just accumulating stuff because I was trying to fill a need versus dealing with, wow, little Walli didn't get everything that she wanted, right? And now really focusing on the things that would make me happy. I would have clothes with tags on it because I purchased it on an impulse because I thought it looked good. And then I was like, wait, this is not my size or my style or my fit. I would never wear this, but I would just pick it up, right? So I would have clothes in my closet with tags on it. And I talk about that now, but at the time, it didn't seem wasteful to me. It seemed like, oh, I will wear it one day, right? And again, because I didn't understand that I was filling a need from as a kid where I couldn't get a lot of stuff. So now I just wanted stuff and I wanted to accumulate.
Thank you for sharing that, Walli. I think I'm going to speak for myself. There's so many things in what you shared that I can kind of relate to, in that impulse shopping. You're at the grocery store and you see those things that are at the register, which are absolutely intended for that impulse buy, and trying to recognize that and asking yourself, do I really need this thing? Just stopping to do that. It's like, I'm not going to say it's a battle, but some days there's like a point when I have to really ask myself, do I absolutely need this? Why am I even buying this thing? And I think that there's probably a lot of listeners who can relate to that. and the story about the tags on your clothes still. That hasn't been my thing so much. I'm always about like, I got to try it on. I got to make sure it looks right before I'm even going to buy it. But I'm sure there are listeners who can see themselves in that experience. And so I think really you need to stop and look at why are we doing that? And what is it that we feel like we're missing or trying to fill inside ourselves that is sort of inspiring us, I guess, if you will, or, blindly making us buy these things. And so, yeah, great stuff to think about. I love it. So let's talk a little bit about some maybe advice that you have for people who feel like they're bad with money and they don't know how to manage money, and the money comes in and it just goes out and they don't know what's happening, or they're really scared about what it even means to save.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to mention, because you said that the question that you asked yourself is, do I really need this? And I think sometimes, I think that's a great place to start is, do I need this? It's okay if the answer is no. The next question is, why do I want this? And really sort of understanding it's okay to want things. I have over a dozen items, maybe 2 dozen items sitting in my Amazon like shopping cart. Okay. So I've done the research. I'm like, I do want this at some point. So it's okay to want things. It's okay to want to remodel a kitchen. It's okay to want to upgrade your car. It's okay to want to have a nice outfit or have that expensive handbag, whatever the case might be. So this is not about depriving things that we enjoy, right? We want to be thinking about going from sort of the mindless, impulsive shopping. I don't even remember what I purchased kind of mind frame to making sure that you're making intentional spending decisions. So I went really from like a mindless shopper to a more intentional spender. And when I was thinking about things, one of the sort of tricks that I did was that I equated everything that I purchased to the amount of hours that it was going to take me to afford the thing. And so for some things, it was like, okay, that's going to be 3 hours worth of work. That's totally fine. Now, I wasn't even an hourly employee, but it helped me really to sort of think about the amount of effort and whether or not it was going to be worth it, right? Okay, this is going to be 10 hours worth of work. Is that worth it? And sometimes the answer was like, not that much. And then sometimes the answer was yes. And so we just want to understand, yes, we want to make sure that we're filling our most essential needs. It's okay to want things, but make sure that we're understanding why. Are we purchasing this because it looks really cute and we'll find a place to fit it into the house, right? Especially now with things where we can buy things with one single click, right? So it's so easy. So we just want to, it's okay to want things. It's okay to buy things that you don't necessarily need, but that is going to add value to your life, add joy, even some convenience, right? But just to take that pause and say, okay, is this something that not only I need or something that I really want, but why? What is it about this thing that is filling a need that I might have, right? Is it I'm buying it just to make me happy? Is there anything else that I could do that would feel just as gratifying as purchasing this to bring me some joy? As something else that maybe doesn't require spending money, right? Or even if we're thinking about, for me, clothes was a huge thing. So it was like, okay, would I rather spend $70 on this thing, or would I rather have like a really nice meal with some friends and maybe even pay for them? Right? Take them out to lunch or brunch. So we just want to take a moment and understand not just what the price tag is, but what the true cost is. Now, let's talk about savings. This happens when we attach very specific goals to what it is, right? Saving for the sake of saving isn't a lot of fun and it is not motivating. Right. So we talked about sort of having those two buckets of like, okay, we have the emergency fund. This is if I lose my job, I'm able to keep a roof over my head. These are for those unplanned expenses. And again, you get to create that framework of what are the questions you're going to ask yourself about whether or not is an emergency. Then we're going to have that bucket of the saving to spend. So when we're thinking about holidays, right? When we're thinking about going on a summer vacation, when we're thinking about summer camp for kids, when we're thinking about the tuition, about the kids' activities, when we're thinking about some getaways or some memories or experiences you want to pay for, some home maintenance projects that you might want to do, right? We really want to get crystal clear about what those expenses are and what those goals are. And also understand, is this something that I'm going to need in the next 3 months, 6 months? Is this more like a 12-month goal? Is this going to be a 4-year goal? So we want to attach not just what the goal is, but attach a time frame, because that will help us see not only when should I get started saving, but also when will I be using the money for. So I like to divide the goals in short-term goals, which is anything 18 months or less, 12 months, 6 months. These are things that we know are coming up and we're going to be setting some money aside for it. Then we have those midterm goals. Sometimes those midterm goals have a little bit higher of a price tag. Maybe it's okay if it happens in 2 years, but 3 years would be fine too, right? There might be a little bit more flexibility. There may not be a time sensitivity, but when we're thinking about those midterm goals, are those things coming up in the next 2 to 5 years? And then we have long-term goals. And the long-term goals are the things that we're thinking about 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now. And what is it that we want to be doing? What is it that we want to be funding, right? And many times when we're thinking about long-term goals, we think about retirement. Also, maybe saving for a kid's college, right? So if you have a high schooler, that's more of a short-term goal. But if you have a toddler, right? If you have a child who's in the single digits, that is kind of a long-term goal. And the way we save for midterm goals, short-term goals, and long-term goals are very different. We want to make sure that we're using the right financial tools available to us for every single one of these tools. And so a short-term goal, we would use something like a savings account. And specifically, I like a high yield savings account. And that just simply means it has a higher interest rate. So I think one actionable step that the listeners could do is just call your bank or maybe go online and say, how much money is the money that I have saved earning, right? What is the interest rate on this savings account? And then we'll do the same thing for those midterm goals. We might use something like a CD or maybe even a different type of high yield savings account. And then those long term goals, we want to make sure that that money is earning money on itself, but higher than a high yield savings account. And where we get that is using things like the stock market, right? When we're thinking about the 401k, people don't realize that that money is being invested, and we want that money to grow not just at the same rate of our savings account, but maybe growing a little bit faster. And that is one of the things that we can do.
So, Wally, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, the detail in there. So many great things for the listeners to think about. And I know from my own experience, like this idea of the short term, midterm, and long term goals and the different ways that you can save for those things is so important for my kids. Trying to prepare for when they were going to go to college. We began when the kids were like elementary school age and 529 plan. And so if the listeners don't know about that, Google it. This is specifically for education and can only be used for that. And that's where it's invested in the stock market, but can be like a little bit safer than just regular stock market investments. And that money can grow all of those years. You just keep putting a little into it and it grows. And then when they're ready to go to college, hopefully you've got a nice little amount there that can help them not have to take out those student loans. So great points in there about remembering for short term, you want to have it in something like the high yield savings account, which is going to give you better interest, but you can access it quickly when you're ready to use it. So great, great stuff. Thank you. Excellent. I love it.
One thing I want to mention about the 529 plan is that a couple of years ago, there was actually a change. So before it could only be used for higher education, now it could be used for even if you have your children in private school for high school or elementary or middle school. So it can be accessed not only for higher education, it could also be accessed for things like trade schools. Now, one of the fears that people might have is, what happens if my child decides not to go to college? Then what happens to that money? Well, few years ago, there was a change that stated that, first of all, the money can be transferred to another beneficiary. So if you have one child who decides not to go to college, you can transfer the money to the next child or to any person. So if you decide to go back to school, or you have a niece or a nephew or a grandchild, you can use that money for them. But if you choose to keep the beneficiary the same, so you choose to keep your child who didn't go to college the same, that 529 can then be used as a retirement account when the child becomes an adult and is ready to retire, which is really, really great. So you never lose access to that money. If it's intended for that person, if it's intended for that specific child, you can use that money for them. They just might have to wait a little bit later in their lives to access it. But imagine having saved and invested money for kids' retirement starting at the age of 10, what that would look like by the time they're 65 or maybe 50 if they choose to retire early, for example.
Oh gosh, thank you, Wally, for sharing that. I did not know about the change in that you could actually use it for retirement. So that's new. Thank you so much for explaining that to myself and the listeners. It is a tremendous option. Really, you could transfer it to a spouse, a child, a grandchild, your parent, whatever, whoever's going to use the money, that it can be moved or just save for their own retirement. So that is tremendous. And what a great opportunity if they choose not to use it for higher education, but also that they can use it for private schools, for elementary and high school as well. That's something I didn't know either. Thank you for that information. Okay, so let me see where I want to go from here. When we launched the show, I had mentioned that you retired at 39, which is so fantastic. Congratulations on that. And before we started the show, you also had talked about you're the first in your family to reach a pretty big milestone in your financial well-being. So would you share some of that with us and tell us what that was like?
Yeah. So I mentioned before how in my 20s, I thought I was good with money because even though I was impulse shopping a lot, I stayed out of credit card debt. I had an ideal job. I never had the Sunday scaries. Like, I really enjoyed my job until I didn't. And there was a shift and a change in management, and sort of an ideal workplace became someplace that felt so heavy to go to. And I had a couple of options. One of my options was to leave that job and to go find another job, which was very scary. And I was in a specialized field, so I couldn't just go anywhere. So I felt like that wasn't really an option for me at that time. And then the other option was to say, peace out, I'm out of here. I will figure it out. And what I realized was that, remember I mentioned that I did save a little bit. And when I'm talking about a little bit, I'm talking about $25 a paycheck, but I did it pretty consistently. And I realized that if I lost one paycheck, I would really be in trouble. And if I lost two paychecks, I would lose everything that I worked really hard for. And that realization really stopped me in my tracks. And I was making decent money and realized that I had nothing to show for it. So the way the universe works, I was sort of scrolling online one day, and this very clickbaity headline came up, and it said, couple in their 30s retires to travel the world. And when I read that article, my mind was blown. They introduced me to two things. One was funding your own retirement, and that retirement was a number and not an age. I had bought into the idea that you had to wait until 65 to retire. So they really kind of stretched my brain there a little bit about, wait a minute, you can fund your own retirement. And then the next question is, but how do you do that? And that the other piece was by building wealth. Now, there are a couple of wealth building avenues or vehicles. One of them is real estate, one of them is entrepreneurship, and the other one is the stock market. And for me, the stock market seemed very scary. I had no idea what it was. I equated it to gambling, right? I was like, people leave crying when they leave the casinos and people cry on Wall Street. So I wanted to stay as far away from the stock market as possible. But the more that I read and what I learned was that this couple in particular were using very simple, very basic strategies that I had access to. And one of them included my 401k. And I didn't know that contributing to your 401k what could be a form of investing. Now, the reason why I say could be is because one of the mistakes that I had done was I had money taken out of my paycheck and it was contributing to the 401k, but I didn't realize that you had to choose the investments. Remember, so when I started in my job, like most of us, they give us a stack full of HR papers and you just sign here and sign there. I didn't understand what a 401k was. My family, my parents never had access to a 401k. So I didn't realize that number one, 401ks can be a wealth building vehicle. But most importantly, the reason for that is because that money can be invested and that money is automated. And I like to always start with tax advantage accounts and retirement accounts for this simple reason. There's some high tax benefits to that. And so when people ask me, oh, what do you invest in? I know that the question they're asking me is like for some hot stock pick. And where I always bring back the question is, well, are you investing in your workplace retirement account? So that could be a 401k. Some people have a thrift savings plan if you're a government employee or military family. Maybe a 403b. This is available for people who are in the nonprofit city or government employees. They may have something called a 403b. But if you're self-employed and you're like, I don't have access to an employer-sponsored retirement account, you too have access to retirement accounts in something like a Roth IRA, a traditional IRA, a SEP IRA, of solo 401k. And I know I just mentioned the alphabet soup. I don't know why here in America we use very difficult terms for these things. But I just want you to know that these things are available to you. And the reason we want to start there is because these type of accounts have some tax benefits. Some of those accounts, if we save money into them, if we contribute and invest money into them, the IRS gives us a lower tax bill. It reduces our taxable income. And so when we're thinking, okay, do I want to pay X amount of money going into taxes, or would I rather save for myself? And if you save for yourself, the government, the IRS, incentivizes you doing that by reducing your tax liability. So again, these might be some more complex strategies and complex thoughts, but they don't have to be. And I hope that you've been able to at least understand that, wait a minute, I do have a 401k. Let me go check to make sure that that money is being invested. And that could be with a simple phone call to your plan administrator and asking the question, is this money just sitting there, or is it actually being invested? And so this is always the place where I have people sort of think about at the beginning when they're thinking about building wealth, is using those tax beneficial or tax advantage accounts when we're thinking about investing. But remember, it's a two-step process. It's not just putting money in, it's also choosing the investments.
Yeah. Okay. Great stuff. Thank you so much for sharing that. A lot of detail. Yes, there was a lot of different options that you were
Acronyms.
detailing. Yeah, acronyms, exactly. But the point is that there are options for lots of different people and lots of different career types and paths. And so just knowing that those are available, now you have like a place to start and explore those options and see what is right for you where you're at. And that really can make a difference in what your future looks like, right?
And that was exactly what happened, right? So I started understanding these different types of tax advantage accounts. And I realized that if I put money there, that money would grow for me. So one of the things that was happening was I was married at the time. Well, I'm still married, but me and my husband were married and we had a conversation and we realized that not only could I put money into my 401k, but he could also put money into his 401k. And so now we began increasing the amount of money that we put into our 401k. And then we started really focusing in on, again, widening the gap between the amount of money that we made and the amount of expenses, right? So that whatever was left over, we could use to build wealth, so that we could use to save. And slowly we began decreasing what we were spending money on, some of those frivolous things that didn't matter to us, that didn't really add any value to our lives. And with that extra money, we then used other vehicles and other tools to build wealth. And as we did that, as we continued to invest that money grew. And so from the time that we first learned about it, it was about 8 years. It took about an 8-year process. But we went from sort of putting minimal amounts into our 401ks to and then reaching the point that our nest egg of all of our investments was now producing more money than he and I were making at our full-time jobs. And that was when I realized that not only had I reached financial independence, I had become work optional. And I decided whether or not I wanted to exercise the working aspect, right? I could decide whether or not I wanted to continue to work. My goal was never to sit on a beach and not be productive and not do anything. It was just to be able to have more control over my time, to be able to focus on the things that I loved and be able to do the things that I was really passionate about. And for me, when I decided to retire from a 19-year career in public service, I decided to share with people what I had learned, what they don't teach us in school about how to sort of, the old phrase was balance a checkbook, right? Now we don't really use checkbooks anymore, but how to understand the amount of money that we're making, understanding our expenses, really creating a savings plan, a debt payoff plan, and then a wealth building plan. And so for me, sure, I work quote unquote now because I am a financial coach and I love what I do. But I do this really because I want other families to really be impacted by the opportunity of not only changing your own life, but changing a whole cycle of maybe poverty or maybe of living paycheck to paycheck, but now building wealth and maybe even generational wealth. And so these are all of the things that happened for me. So we took about 8 years. There were a lot of things that happened along the way, including a pandemic. But we really focused on the things that was important to us. And I retired. And then 1 year later, my husband joined me in retirement. So now we are two, and we live in New York City. We live in a very high cost of living area. So for someone who might be saying, oh, you must live in like Kentucky where rent is 500. No, we live in a very high cost of living area, but we were able to use the stock market in order to build wealth and reach financial independence. And so now my portfolio pays my bills.
That's just fantastic, Walli. Bravo for that. I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that it really gives the listeners an opportunity to see perhaps this is possible for me too. If I can just explore these options and begin to take advantage of what is out there and available. So thank you again for sharing that. And we're getting so close to the time. I know there's so much more that we could be talking about because we've barely touched the surface on this. But would you share, Walli, if there is any last thoughts that you really think the listener should know about this topic that you maybe haven't shared to this point? What would you like to say now?
I would say there was a lot of acronyms and a lot of concepts and strategies, again, that we don't learn in school. You don't need to know all of it. It's okay to ask for support, to ask for help in this area. There's some fantastic books and blogs and podcasts that I can share about what were some of the things that were really inspiring to me. But the first step is just to get to know your numbers. That's really what we want to start with. Understand. Open up those statements that maybe you've been hiding. Open up your paycheck stub statement and try to understand how much am I making? How much am I actually bringing home? How much goes to taxes, right? Really understand where the income is coming from. And then do an expense audit and really go through what all of your expenses are and see how it aligns with the type of life you want to live. Not just right now, but also thinking about the type of life you want to shape and form with the money that you are bringing in. So really get intimate with your numbers and start there.
Yeah. Great point. Great point. Thank you. And so you mentioned books and podcasts. What would you like to share that have been helpful or beneficial that you think the listeners should check out?
There's so many great books and podcasts out there. I would say the book that really helped simplify what it meant to build wealth, particularly using something like the stock market, is a book by a gentleman. His name is J.L. Collins, and the book is called The Simple Path to Wealth. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is that he wrote this book for his daughter. He was kind of a money nerd. He was in the financial industry. His daughter did not want to hear anything about this. She was overwhelmed with all of the acronyms. And he wrote this book for her. And it's very, very conversational, storytelling, and really sort of helped me understand something like a 401k, for example. Like, why would I start there, right? Should I get, some fancy investing app? Should I work with a financial advisor? And it really sort of helped me to understand what could I do on my own. And he made it very simple. So that was a book that really sort of transformed my life. And I'm a huge podcast listener. There's two podcasts that I'm going to recommend. One is the Afford Anything podcast. And I love this tagline. It's afford anything, but not everything. And it's a mixture of financial conversations, but also mixed in with a lot of the psychology of spending and buying and even investing. So I really enjoy that podcast. And the second podcast is called Popcorn Finance. And I love this podcast because it's very quick, short episodes. Usually the tagline there is you'll hear a finance tip in the time it takes to make a bag of popcorn. So they're about 5 minutes long. The podcast host has a fantastic voice, but I really enjoy that podcast because you can look through the library and see if there's a topic that you want to hear. But those are sort of the two podcasts that I would recommend.
Well, all of those recommendations are fantastic. I love the book. It sounds like it's something that really everyone can read and understand and begin to build their knowledge around this topic, and two fantastic podcasts as well. So I'll include all the info in the show notes. And so lastly, Walli, would you share with the listeners how they can find you and see the work that you're doing? If they have questions for you and just want to learn more, how would they be able to do that?
Yeah, thank you so much again, Desiree, for having me on. And I can be reached at financiallythriving.com. I am a one-on-one coach. So if you're interested in getting some additional support, creating a plan, starting with the basics, and then moving to the next level, I would love to hear from you. And I'm most active on Instagram. So financially_thriving. Either one of those two places, you can shoot me an email or send me a message, and I would love to connect.
Perfect. And I will detail all that in the show notes so the listeners can easily find you. And again, Walli, thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing this tremendous information with us and educating us on all these options. It has just been fantastic. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk more soon. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to another insightful episode of the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. We appreciate your time and curiosity as we explore fascinating topics together. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to join us next week for another amazing episode. Remember, your journey of learning and growth is a continuous adventure, and we're thrilled to be part of it. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next week, stay curious and keep exploring those pockets of knowledge.